Now we're back to the side-by-side view of our SKAN Pro talent acquisition software, and I have a very important reason of why we need to review this side-by-side comparison of these two case studies. So once again, just to reiterate, we have case study number 1 on the left-hand side, which we would call a weak analysis, versus case study number 2 on the right-hand side that we would call a strong analysis. Now I want to just throw a hypothetical out there. You've posted a position online that you're hiring for. And let's say, hypothetically, 30 people apply for this position. One of the benefits to SKAN Pro is that we are going to help you save time in the interview process by only interviewing people who score as well as case study number 2. So from a side-by-side comparison, when you look at these two, you would say, well, if we've bought into the philosophy that we want to build a culture or maintain a culture within our organization of servant and transformational leadership, then we only want to hire people who have those skills. So when you get all of those candidates in, they've applied for the job and you've sent the invitation out to each and every one of them, and all of the assessments are now back in and you're ready to make your decision on who you will interview, then you look through these reports and you say, we want the people who scored a 5.0 or better in our SKAN Pro talent acquisition software. So you can thumb through them and you can look at them, and even for face value, you're going to look at these and go, well, anyone who has a strong score in the competencies or even a low score in the personality graphic, these are the ones that we want to interview. So if you were to do that, then I can promise you, you're going to save hours upon hours of time in interviewing. But here's what we need you to understand, because as you've already looked through this software, you've noticed something very interesting. There is a table that looks much like this. Now, I want to help you understand this table. You can thumb through those graphics if you want to. You can thumb through the reports, but what this table is doing for you is it is prioritizing all of the reports in 3 different categories: gold, silver, and bronze. You've got gold standard, silver standard, and bronze standard. So what you can see though is we've got gold A, gold B, silver A, and silver B. And we've got all of these different columns here. You can see the columns: introversion, extroversion, ambivert, social receptivity, which we've already talked about, servant leadership, transformational leadership, and overall. So if you're wanting to understand how this table works, the first thing that we're going to do is understand who gets categorized into what standard. So what the software is doing for you, it is identifying the people who scored in the overall. So for the gold standard, they're going to have scored a 5.0 and higher. That's what qualifies them for gold. Silver standard is 4.9 to 4.0. And bronze standard is 3.9 and below. By the way, I would eliminate all the bronze standard folks from your consideration right off the bat. So this is how they get aggregated. This is how they get prioritized, is by overall score. So the next thing that we look at that I think is important for you to pay attention to as you're trying to figure out who you will interview is the servant leadership score. Now, I've already said in the chapters before that the servant leadership score is very important. And the reason for that is the skills that define transformational leadership are those that help a leader cause other people to be more productive and more efficient. The way that a leader can do that and have that productivity and that efficiency last is if that leader has strong relationship building and communication skills. And that's where servant leadership comes in. So it's really important that the foundation of your candidate's leadership skills is built on servant leadership. Therefore, gold standard A are those who not only scored a 5.0 and better in the overall, but at least a 5.0 in servant leadership. Now, when we look at gold standard B, they are still categorized as the gold standard because in the overall, they scored a 5.0 and better. However, what drops them to a standard of B is because their servant leadership was below 5.0. So as you can see with Jill Perry and Bill Regan in the gold standard B, They fall in the gold standard, but their servant leadership is lower than their transformational leadership. Is this necessarily a reason to disqualify them? No, it is not. But there are other people on this table that might be more of a priority than these two. So very important to keep in mind that servant leadership needs to be at least a 5.0 just as the overall. The next thing that we want to pay attention to is going back to the topic of social receptivity. Now, as we talked before, we have the social extremes and we have the social norms. Now, again, the social norms are people whose personality scores fell within the two temperaments that are the largest percentage of our population. The social extremes are those who fell into one of the two outer portions of the personality spectrum, meaning the extreme introvert or the extreme extrovert. Now, what we can see is we have three people within the gold standard, one in A and two in B, who have come in as social extremes. Now, again, just as the low servant leadership score does not necessarily disqualify a person for consideration, neither does the social extremes, but it is something to pay attention to. For example, let's take a look at Jim Bronson. Jim Bronson falls into gold standard A because he has a 5.3 in his overall. He did really well in servant leadership. He has a 5.6 and a 5.0 in transformational leadership. However, he does have the social receptivity of an extreme. And the reason for that is because we can look at his introversion score and he has an 11. So what this tells us is if he is falling under the category of social extreme and he has 11 in introversion, that means he is a really strong introverted melancholy individual. So while he has strong transformational and servant leadership skills, Jim struggles with high levels of anxiety. He may not like to deal with people problems as much. He may force himself into it, which is why he scored so well. But this is just something to pay attention to. So if you were to hire Jim, this would definitely be an area in which you could help him improve, knowing that this is something that he may struggle with in his personality. Now, we move down to the gold standard B with Jill Perry and Bill Regan. Now, this is where it gets a little interesting because they did fall into the gold standard because of the 5.0 minimum that they scored overall, but their servant leadership score was below the 5.0, and they both came in as a social extreme. Their social receptivity is extreme. Let's start with Bill Regan. He scored a 5 in introversion and a 10 in extroversion. If the software identifies him as a social extreme and he scored a 10 in extroversion, then what that means is Bill is a strong, extroverted, cleric, dominant individual. This does become a concern for me because the servant leadership is lower than the transformational leadership and lower than 5.0. I get a little apprehensive with people like this because if they have that very aggressive nature and their servant leadership is low, this might be a challenging person. And again, this gets interesting because they did fall in the gold standard with a 5.0, but now I think it just becomes a mathematical result. The same thing with Jill Perry. She too falls into the gold standard because of a 5.1. However, her servant leadership score was below a 5.0 and she came in her social receptivity as extreme. Now with her, when we look at the numeric values of introversion and extroversion, they are a solid 7 and 7, which is where this ambivert thing comes in. An ambivert is somebody who is a balanced introvert and extrovert, either identical numeric values or off by 1. In this particular case, she's a 7 and a 7, but she does have a social receptivity of extreme. So again, this is just a mathematical result. So we really don't know without looking at her personality graphic, which one of those personality types, introvert or extrovert, that she scored the highest in. So moving beyond this graphic, we would have to pull her report, and who knows, we might see something like a 6 in dominant and a 1 in the sanguine and a 3, 4 or a 2, 1, 4 in the other half of the introversion. So it really becomes a mathematical issue. So the bottom line is what we do is we look at these two in gold standard B and we say, wow, the social receptivities are both extreme. Their servant leadership is low. I'm not sure they are a priority. So what do we do then? Do we just focus on the top 4 in gold standard A? I don't think I would. I would look down into silver A. I would move down into the silver standard because here's where it gets interesting. They fall into the silver standard because their overall score was less than a 5.0. But what gets really fascinating for Susan Johns and Keith Hart is that their servant leadership scores were higher than their overall scores, and their social receptivities were normal. These are two people who just, because their scores are what they are, they fell in the silver standard. But I would take Susan Johns and Keith Hart over Jill Perry and Bill Regan in gold standard B, simply because their social receptivities were normal and their servant leadership scores were higher than a 4.0, in spite of the fact that their overall was a 4.9 and a 4.6. 4.9 is still pretty good. I mean, that's a good score. Now, when we get down into silver B, we don't really want to interview them. You really have a fantastic pool of people to interview from. So again, we talked about the ambiversion and what that means, but here's what I would recommend. If you're looking at this table and you're saying, boy, who should we really focus on? Priority is the people who fall in gold standard A. These are going to be the best opportunity for you to interview less people and know that the group of people are going to be very, very highly effective. And if you need to, you can move down into this particular category. Now, every table for every position is going to be different. You're not necessarily going to see people in silver A take a priority over silver B, but you just have to understand how the table is prioritizing and aggregating people. But in this particular case, because silver A has social receptivities of norm and their servant leadership scores are above 5.0, then in my expert opinion, they take priority over gold standard B.